Good morning, folks. Today's conversation I am entitling Virtue Ethics, Part 1. We are discussing Chapter 17 in Russ Schaefer Landau's book, The Fundamentals of Ethics, in which he covers virtue ethics. I do want to note it is fairly difficult to do justice to virtue ethics, particularly in the context of one chapter of a survey course. That's unfortunately how survey courses go. However, I will try to fill in any kind of details about virtue ethics that are not expressly discussed in the textbook in hopes of doing more justice to virtue ethics. To cheat ahead for a minute, the tradition of virtue ethics goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks. Specifically, one of the major source books that's excerpted in your textbook, The Ethical Life, is from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. It is a major and heavily anthologized source book that articulates the positions of virtue ethics. However, I do want to note that the virtue approach to the good life and right and wrong tended to be pervasive among Greek intellectuals, because in a way, it also defines the good life. Now, I like most of the normative theories we have discussed so far. Virtue ethics will frame ethics not in terms of what should I do in this particular situation, and what principle defines why I should act in this particular way. Instead, virtue ethics begins by asking this question: what kind of person ought I to be? What kind of person ought I to be? Now, the answer to that question will define its approach to how we ought to comport ourselves, how we ought to conduct ourselves. And it will also explain, and this is something we saw by the end of the chapter, it also addresses the question about what is the nature of happiness. In other words, what does it mean to live a good, decent, human life? So yeah, it kind of ties within its normative theory, its approach to value theory. And that's one thing I like very much about virtue ethics. Now, the author of the text gives us an example near the beginning of the chapter to try to set the stage for virtue ethics. I like to call it the reluctant police officer example. The point the author is trying to make is we have this particular police officer who does everything by the book. But the only reason that he does things by the book is because he is afraid of getting into trouble if he were to act otherwise. Now, you'll notice that virtue ethics wouldn't call this man a good person, even though he behaves as if he's a good person. And this is because virtue ethics is concerned with motivation. In other words, we ought to be motivated to be virtuous. We haven't explained what virtuous is yet. But in other words, virtue ethics is not just about the right outcomes, even though good outcomes do typically matter. But it also incorporates the idea that we ought to be motivated to be virtuous. This is why, even though the reluctant police officer's behavior is consistent with what virtue would demand, he's still not necessarily a virtuous person. In other words, if he's only being by the book because he's afraid of getting caught, then to use that cliche, he is not motivated by virtue. He is not motivated by virtue. Now, I'm going to drop this word that the author does not drop yet. But virtue ethics will be largely concerned with what we would call good character development. I don't mean as a story. I mean the development of good character traits. Now, these good character traits, these excellences, we refer to as virtues. Now, a lack of or too much of a particular trait, we refer to as a vice. So the idea is that you ought to seek to become, you ought to seek to act in accordance with virtue, live a virtuous life, and you should seek to avoid vices, or what we call vicious behavior. Now, I've already talked about the origins of virtue ethics. Oh, and by the way, folks, there's quite a few people today who think a virtue approach is a better model for ethics. Now, remember how I said earlier in the course that St. Thomas Aquinas' natural law ethics was heavily influenced by Aristotle? Well, St. Thomas's ethics will turn out to also have been heavily influenced by Aristotle. And I have some friends who would refer to themselves as Thomists to some extent. In other words, they are Catholic, and they largely look on reality in similar ways as the way St. Thomas Aquinas did. Now, if you've ever heard of the deadly sins, a more proper word for those deadly sins is deadly vices, by the way. Is deadly vices. Because to be vicious in the Catholic tradition is to be sinful. To try to see virtues, and by the way, virtues are their own reward. Virtues are their own reward. Making the virtues part of your life will enable you to live a better life. And it will also enable you to deal with life's dilemmas a little bit better. But yeah, I have some friends who are vaguely Thomist, who actually appreciate the virtue tradition quite a bit. And by the way, there's plenty of people who don't happen to be religious who also appreciate the virtue ethics approach. I will admit, I have some appreciation for it myself. But anyway, the standard of right action according to virtue ethics. Do those things that are consistent with what a virtuous person would do. In other words, see what kind of behavior in this situation would embody the virtue, and then do to the best of your ability, seek to do so. Now, among some of the virtues, and admittedly the author talks about this later in the textbook, courage is one of those quintessential examples of a virtue. Now, rightly, we admire people who behave courageously. And we also rightly tend to feel sorry for people who are cowardly. Notice I didn't say that we look down on them necessarily. We feel rightly sorry for cowardly people. And this is because we think such people are missing something. And the answer is they are. They are missing the right amount of a particular virtue. And in missing that virtue of courage, your life is likely to be missing some things, deficient. Now, a person with too much courage is said to be foolhardy. In other words, doesn't have that rational capability of holding back too much of his or her courage. The person with too much courage, foolhardy, that is likely to get into trouble and to do stupid things. The courageous person weighs a situation, knows what he or she ought to do, and has the fortitude to do the best she can to do it. Doesn't mean she'll succeed, by the way. However, if you know that something is a losing venture, guess what virtue might tell you to do? Pick your battles wisely. Because not picking your battles wisely might actually be foolhardiness. Not picking your battles wisely might actually be foolhardiness. Now, I want to be clear here. To live in consistency with the virtues is to have attained what we will be referring to as practical life wisdom. And we'll talk about why nobody is born with this. We will, if it's not already obvious already. Now, I talked a little bit about this here. Now, the author talks about something central to virtue development. And it's what the author called a moral exemplar. A moral exemplar refers to an individual who embodies the virtues, aka a virtuous person. Now, for a novice, the virtuous person is supposed to serve as a role model. The idea is if you want to find out how to live a good, virtuous life, you ought to look to those people who possess the virtues and try to mimic the way they comport and conduct themselves. Now, to be clear about this, most of us are not virtuous by nature, and this is why we need to see examples of what virtuous people are and how virtuous people decision make and comport themselves. But the idea is that even if the virtues do not come naturally to you, that does not absolve you of moral responsibility. As a matter of fact, if you are rationally aware that you are lacking in virtue, as a moral agent, you have a duty to yourself and to other people to try to become more virtuous. And the idea is something like this. If you act like a person who possesses the virtues often and enough, that eventually, out of habit, they will become part of your character. Eventually, they will become part of your character. Now, let me give you another easy go-to example. Most of us think that the lazy person is deficient. Laziness is a vice. Industriousness, that is a virtue. If you happen to know that you are not particularly industrious, guess what you gotta do? You gotta start to behave in ways that industrious people do. It might not be fun, you might not enjoy it at first, but guess what? With enough practice at it, you will reorient yourself. And where you may have been lazy before, you may be able to develop yourself into a person who is in fact industrious. Now, to get ahead of myself a little bit and to talk about this holistically, the author of the text is clear about this. Virtue ethics actually incorporates a powerful motivator for becoming virtuous. Number one, people tend to admire virtuous people. And it's not a bad thing to want to be admired, particularly if that desire for admiration pushes you in the direction of virtue. Now, here's another important reason why becoming virtuous has a bit built-in motivation. Becoming virtuous is something that will set you up to live a better life. In other words, if you embody the virtues in your life, you won't likely be a miserable person. You will likely be what Aristotle would call a happy person. Who doesn't want to be happy? As a matter of fact, that is a central question. Why live? Well, I'd like to live a happy, decent life. Well, what's a happy life? Well, Aristotle would say, a life that embodies the virtues is what sets one up for happiness. And this is because you will embody the character traits that will help you to live well, dealing with life on life's terms. Because difficulties will be thrown at you. People who have the virtues will be more equipped to deal with difficulties, life's everyday challenges. This is why virtue ethics is sometimes referred to as embodying practical wisdom. Now, the author of the text talks about moral complexity in virtue ethics. And this is a theme we talked about in the last chapter, too. Remember that one of the strengths of ethical monisms was its simplicity. A lot of people seem to like the idea that monistic theories reduce morality to one principle or duty, that all you have to do is figure out how to follow that, and you will have done the right thing. Well, pluralistic theories tend to think that while magic bullets for figuring out what the right thing to do seems simple and fine and nice, that they tend to fail to address life and morality in its full-blown complexity. Because why? Typically, when we treat one person as an end in themselves, we end up treating other people as means. That means that Kantian ethics seem to lead to contradictions. If we talk about pursuing the general welfare, as utilitarianism does, sometimes pursuing the general welfare means doing direct, horrible harm to some people. In other words, there are odd people out who would end up being victimized if we carry out utilitarianism to its full extent in some circumstances. So yeah, these monistic theories seem to create contradictions in some circumstances. Now, what pluralistic theories try to do is they try to deal with morally complex scenarios. Instead of necessarily telling us what the right thing to do is, virtue ethics would say, look at the particulars of a complex moral scenario and ask yourself, what ought a person who possesses the virtues to do in this situation? What ought a person who possesses the virtues to do in this situation? Now, once you've answered that question, you will have your answer to the best way to deal with a difficult moral dilemma. Notice I said the best way to deal with it. Because the fact is, morality may, of course, force us to do uncomfortable things that may end up being nonetheless the right thing. Because situations are complex. The fact is, in general, let me give you an example. Honesty is generally speaking a virtue, folks. However, a virtuous person knows that one just shouldn't always do what? Belt out truths that are likely to cause a great deal of harm, that are unnecessary to say. In other words, a virtuous person knows how to behave with discretion. Simply because it's true doesn't mean you've got a duty to say it all the time. Does that make pretty good sense? In other words, experienced people, recognize the complexity and sometimes the subtleties of situations. Now, I want to say a couple more things about this. Now, the author of the text does discuss why we can't expect children to be virtuous. Well, number one, children are developmental anyway. And keep in mind, morality is something that also needs to be developed. According to Aristotle, very few people are virtuous by nature. Now, there are some people who are by nature slightly more virtuous than other people. And part of that is the luck of the genetic draw. Now, some people are also set up for virtue by their life circumstances. In other words, if you happen to be born into a situation where you have moral exemplars around you, you are likely to have the right kind of influences that will enable you to become virtuous. Now, of course, if you happen to be a person who lacks moral exemplars, bad parenting, living in squalor, all kinds of difficulties, we shouldn't be surprised if a person in that environment doesn't develop the virtues. As a matter of fact, most of us would rightly feel sad for such people when we recognize that they didn't have those opportunities. Because we recognize to some extent, and this is mentioned in the textbook near the end of the chapter, moral luck. Sometimes it is the luck of the draw that enables us to be in situations where we will be more likely to develop the virtues, whereas other people might be in situations that might make it a whole lot more difficult. Now this is not mentioned in the text, but I like to mention it. The ancient Greeks were acutely aware of this obvious fact that a whole lot of people in contemporary society seem to deny. There is a reciprocal relationship between individuals and the societies that enable them to develop into the kind of people that they do. The idea is good societies that promote the virtues are likely to end up with virtuous citizens. Societies that teach people to have vicious values are likely to produce vicious citizens. In other words, bad societies can have a lot to do with what people turn out to be. This is why, in social commentary here, this is why some of us say, if you want to know why our children are supposedly so awful, as some of the older generation say, how many of you know what I'm talking about? There's always something wrong with the younger generation. I said, you should look in the darn mirror. Because if they're wretched like you say they are, you are the ones who reared them. You are the ones who bequeathed them with this society that's led to them being disrespectful and all this other stuff. Well, guess what? I've seen just as many disrespectful old people as I have young people. And that's why I get so angry when people are always ragging on the younger generation. If they blow chunks as badly as you say they blow chunks, look in the mirror. Perhaps you had something to do with it. If you promote values that suggest that money can buy happiness, it's no wonder that people are willing to throw other people under the bus to make a buck. Does that make sense? If you promote the idea that getting ahead is more important than being virtuous and decent, it's no wonder we've got the kind of leaders we've got. And this is the kind of thing that sets up a society, maybe not for doom tomorrow, maybe not for doom next year, but it's a collision course. So yeah, if you want to know why things are likely to get worse before they're going to get better, well, the idea is if a society is based in vicious principles, it's no wonder that the citizens turn out to be vicious. Yeah, this idea, I think it's a powerful observation. And you know what? It should be obvious. And I think it is to some extent obvious. I think people, however, have this problem with looking in the mirror. They have a lot easier time pointing out what's wrong with every other society and perhaps not looking at the problems with their own. Yeah, perhaps the grass isn't greener over here, to use that old cliche. Anywho, sorry to get fired up a little bit. Now, the role of the emotions. This is going to be important, folks, because this ethical model, as well as the feminist ethical model, will not demonize the passions the way that prior normative theories that we've discussed have. As a matter of fact, the emotions, according to Aristotle, are a central part of moral development. Now, keep in mind, I'm referring to a person who has developed moral maturity here. We're not talking about unrestrained emotions here. We're talking about a person who is reflective about his or her emotions, who actually thinks about how he or she feels about things. Now, properly developed emotions, according to the Aristotelian model, can help us to see when something is in fact morally relevant. Easy example, when you see a human being suffering and you can see the anguish on them, and you start to feel uncomfortable, that is empathizing with the pain of the other, perhaps that's telling you something valuable. Because seeing another person in anguish is something that does, in fact, affect us. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why I think, well, guess what? Nobody wants to deal with anguish. Maybe we should try to construct a world where less people deal with preventable anguish. That was just one example. It can help us to see when things are morally relevant. It can help us to see what is right and wrong. Now, I don't know that I 100% like the author's example because I could make a counterexample. Now, suppose I tell a lie to someone, a vicious lie to keep myself out of the soup, and then afterward, I feel the emotion of guilt for it. Perhaps the fact that I feel guilty about it might be telling me something. Perhaps my feeling of guilt is telling me that I did something wrong. Well, Dr. Freud would actually rebuke that. Dr. Freud would say that we are conditioned to feel guilt about certain things. And that simply because we feel guilt about something, it doesn't follow that we should, or that we were actually responsible for it. My uncle was made to feel guilt about the fact that he was a homosexual. Now, simply because society told him that he was an abomination, this was the 60s, didn't mean he was an abomination. As a matter of fact, I'm trying to give you an example of what I would call misplaced guilt. Simply because you feel guilt, it doesn't mean you should feel guilt, and doesn't always mean that it's morally significant. Even though the case that the author gave, I think, is an example of it. Our emotions can also sometimes help us to determine what the right thing to do is. And remember, we're talking about the thoughtful, grappling with one's emotions here. We're not talking about a person who doesn't have mature moral development here. Now, if I didn't say this before, I'm going to say it again. What kind of people do you think, age group, would we more expect to be a moral exemplar? The very, very young or the middle-aged to older? Yeah, the middle-aged to older. Now, this isn't to say that with age comes wisdom. As a matter of fact, I would say with age ought to come wisdom. You get the distinction? And this is because the more things that life has thrown at you, the more things that you've had to deal with, the more things that you've seen, the more things that you have approached and failed at approaching. In other words, you have the wisdom of hindsight. This is why when people ask me for advice as a middle-aged person, I almost always answer humbly. I say, the fact is, I'm a screw-up too. Anyone with any humility knows that he's a screw-up. I said, however, I've been in situations a little bit like this. Here is how I approached it. This is the advice that I would give to my 19-year-old self. This is the advice that I would give to my 19-year-old self in hindsight. Now, that's not to say that I'm 100% virtuous. I'm sure as heck not virtuous. But I have had some experiences. I've done plenty of things that I regret. I've done plenty of things that I regret. But guess what? You can't know that you regret them ahead of time. It's always in hindsight that you regret things. And if you learn the lessons of virtue, you come out of it better equipped to deal with similar situations in the future. Now, I won't go into any TMI examples. I won't go into any too much information examples. Next, I already talked about this, so I don't think I need to mull over this too much more. Moral education, this is just to reiterate. Very few people are born virtuous. As a matter of fact, Aristotle would say no people are born completely virtuous. Now, some people are born more virtuous, probably due to genetic luck. And other people are more likely to have the right influences. But the whole idea here is that virtue is something that you have to work on. It's not something that comes automatically. And there is not some magic formula that will tell you how a virtuous person ought to behave. As a matter of fact, that's the wisdom of experience that can help you to get there. Now, this is going to be a point I made before, but the author reiterates it. This is a point I made with the author's reluctant police officer example. Now, the author of the text talks about the nature of virtue as well as some examples. Now, I'm not going to go into more examples now because I talked about industriousness and I talked about courage. Maybe I'll give you one more. Most of you are probably aware that moderation when it comes to food intake is a virtue. Gluttony is a vice. Can you see? Now, folks, does moderation differ somewhat from person to person? The answer is yes. Because while we are all similar, because we partake of the human form, we are all different. If you have a fast metabolism, you may actually require more calories than a person with a slower metabolism. If you have a high activity level because of the kind of things that you have to do, you will also probably have higher caloric needs. But guess what we all have in common? We all need the same darn nutrients for the most part. And if you don't get the required nutrients, you're likely to be less healthy. If you do get your required nutrients, you are likely to be more healthy. And granted, the exact numbers of how much of those nutrients that you will need will depend upon you and your body type. In other words, it is relative to person, but it's not relative in the sense that it's just an opinion. In other words, the person who comes to know his or her own body well, and that's an experience thing, will know that certain things will happen if you eat too much food. Or if you go wild on spicy food, that you might, pardon the mild vulgarity here, you may pay the price later on. In other words, I know that while I love hot sauce, that I can't go as wild with it as my wife does. Otherwise, it's liable to get disgusting. I think that may have been too much information. But yeah, and it's because of different digestive systems. It's just the way it is. Dealing with life on life's terms. You can't change certain things. But you can figure out the parameters, and you can do the best you can within those parameters. Now, the author made this point again about the person who is merely continent. No vulgar jokes intended there. He's not talking about incontinence. Now, the point the author's trying to make here is that there are some people who may, on the outside, appear to be virtuous. Because they're doing what? And here's the phrase the author uses. You might mistake the person who is able to hold it together as a person who is possessing of the virtues. Whereas it might just be a person who's rushing around to make sure that all the I's are dotted and all the T's are crossed. But they really have no idea what the heck they're doing. And they are not motivated to do the things that they're doing with and for virtuous reasons. This is why a person might appear to possess the virtues, but won't actually possess them. And by the way, folks, if you actually possess the virtues, will things come harder or will things come easier? Actually, the answer is easier, but thanks for giving it a shot. If you actually possess the virtues, things will actually come easier for you. Why? Because you will be motivated to do things for intrinsic reasons. Not to please everybody else, not simply to jump through the hoops. This is why the virtuous student is likely to do better, even if he or she doesn't have all of the innate IQ traits and things of that nature. And it's partly because of the right motivation. Wanted to give a bunch of examples here. Now, we're almost out of time. Now, virtue and the good life. Now, this is a word I want you to know. This word eudaimonia, it's in the textbook. It translates into plain English as happiness. But keep in mind that whenever Aristotle is talking about happiness, he is not talking about a merely hedonistic account of happiness. He's not talking about a life of pleasure being a happy life. However, if you read the chapter, a pleasant life is among the things that are more likely to make happiness possible. In other words, if you don't have 3 hots on a cot, you're not likely to be healthy. You're likely to be worried about when the next meal's coming and so forth. If you have those kind of basic worries, Aristotelian happiness is not likely to happen. This is why people who are extremely impoverished are not likely to be happy in Aristotle's sense. Are not, those I say not likely to be. Then again, very well-off people aren't necessarily going to be happy either, because they might lack wisdom or something. Now, I like to think of Aristotelian Eudaimonia as seeking to live a well-rounded or well-balanced life in accordance with virtue. His ideal type of person who is likely to be happy is likely to live a well-rounded and balanced and multifaceted life. Likely to be interested in a lot of things just because he's curious about stuff. Is likely to have tried a lot of different things and decent in a lot of stuff. But Aristotle's happy person isn't likely a monomaniac. And by the way, our society of specialization probably is not conducive to eudaimonia. You know what I'm talking about? You are told that you're supposed to master just one thing. Maybe not all, but you know, this sort of idea that you're just going to college to develop one skill. That's not what general ed is for. It's supposed to well-round you. The problem is, the idea of jumping through hoops so you can get a job, gives us the mentality that you're just here to jump through hoops to become good at this one thing. Well, guess what? If you've got a decent job, you're going to have leisure time. And if you've got leisure time, you're going to have to do what with it? Hopefully find a way to fill that leisure time with meaningful activities. And by the way, a person who is not well-rounded might have difficulty doing that. A well-rounded person will be multifaceted, will have an array of interests. And by the way, is more likely to be interesting to his or herself and interesting to other people. Is likely to have thought meaningfully about an array of things. And this is part of why a happy person courageously faces life. Even when life blows chunks, courageously faces life. And recognizing that it's all part of the dance, the cosmic dance. Yeah, that sounded a little Eastern religion, that was intentional, so. Yeah, accepting life on its terms and making the best of it. And this might give a hint about what I'm going to say about how virtue ethicists would deal with tragic dilemmas when we segue to the objections part of this lecture. Cheers until then.